In 1945, the Bretton Woods Agreement established the dollar as the world reserve currency, which meant that international commodities were priced in dollars. The agreement, which gave the United States a distinct financial advantage, was made under the condition that those dollars would remain redeemable for gold at a consistent rate of $35 per ounce. The United States promised not to print very much money, but this was on the honor system, because the Federal Reserve refused to allow any audits or supervision of its printing presses. In the years leading up to 1970, expenditures in the Vietnam War made it clear to many countries that the U.S. was printing far more money than it had in gold. And in response, they began to ask for their gold back. This, of course, set off a rapid decline in the value of the dollar. The situation climaxed in 1971 when France attempted to withdraw its gold and Nixon refused.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This was obviously not a temporary suspension, as he claimed, but rather a permanent default. And for the rest of the world who had entrusted the United States with their gold, it was outright theft. In 1973, President Nixon asked King Faisal of Saudi Arabia to accept only US dollars as payment for oil and to invest any excess profits in US Treasury bonds, notes, and bills. In return, Nixon offered military protection for Saudi oil fields. The same offer was extended to each of the world's key oil-producing countries, and by 1975, every member of OPEC had agreed to only sell their oil in US dollars. The act of moving the dollar off of gold and tying it to foreign oil instantly forced every oil-importing country in the world to start maintaining a constant supply of Federal Reserve paper. And in order to get that paper, they would have to send real physical goods to America. This was the birth of the petrodollar. Paper went out, everything America needed came in, and the United States got very, very rich as a result. In November of 2000, Iraq began selling its oil exclusively in euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar and on U.S. financial dominance, and it wasn't going to be tolerated. In response, the U.S. government, with the assistance of the mainstream media, began to build up a massive propaganda campaign claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was planning to use them.
Should terrorists obtain these weapons, now being manufactured and traded around the world, the carnage they could inflict to our economies, our security, to world peace, would be beyond our most vivid imagination. My judgment as Prime Minister is that this threat is real, growing, and of an entirely different nature to any conventional threat to our security that Britain has faced before.
In 2003, the U.S. invaded, and once they had control of the country, oil sales were immediately switched back to dollars. This is particularly notable due to the fact that switching back to the dollar meant a 15 to 20% loss in revenue due to the euro's higher value. It doesn't make any sense at all unless you take the petrodollar into account.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
In Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, which they intended to use to replace the dollar in that region. US and NATO forces helped destabilize and topple the Libyan government in 2011.
Tonight, British forces are in action over Libya. They are part of an international coalition that has come together to enforce the will of the United Nations and to protect the Libyan people.
After taking control of the region, US armed rebels executed Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan Central Bank. Iran has been actively campaigning to pull oil sales off of the dollar for some time now, and it has recently secured agreements to begin trading its oil in exchange for gold. In response, the US government, with mainstream media assistance, has been attempting to build international support for military strikes on the pretext of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. In the meantime, they established sanctions which US officials openly admit are aimed at causing a collapse of the Iranian economy. Syria is Iran's closest ally, and they are bound by mutual defense agreements.
Russia, China, and Iran have all explicitly sided with the Syrian government. Russia is providing air support, advanced anti-aircraft missile systems, heavy weapons, and training. Iran, for its part, has troops on the ground. For the time being, China is more preoccupied with the ongoing tensions in the South China Sea, and has not flexed its muscles in Syria as of yet. However, they should always be considered a wildcard variable. The current Iraqi government is also a wildcard. In 2015, they began to indicate where their loyalties lay in several meaningful ways. For example, they told the US government that new ground operations were not welcome, while at the same time announcing that they intend to look to Russia for military assistance. The list of countries pushing for regime change in Syria is a bit longer. United States, France, England, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel. If seeing all these characters in bed together strikes you as strange, looking at their motives will clarify things considerably. There isn't just one motive for this bloodbath. Rather, there's a matrix of motives which intersect in some rather odd places. Of course, money had to play a role. In 2009, Qatar put forth a proposal to build a natural gas pipeline which would have passed through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, to Turkey, and into Europe. The president of Syria, however, rejected this proposal. Instead, in 2011, he forged a pact with Iraq and Iran to run a pipeline eastward, cutting Qatar and Saudi Arabia out of the loop completely. It was around this time that jihadists began flooding into the region intent on ousting Assad. The West presented these groups as freedom fighters. Iran is Shia. The current government in Iraq is Shia and has strong ties with Iran. The pipeline deal which Assad accepted would strengthen the Shia bloc and expand its regional influence. The Sunnis don't like this. In fact, they've even coined a term to describe it: the Shia Crescent.
Let's be very clear. ISIS is not just a terrorist organization. It is a Sunni terrorist organization. That means it blocks and targets Shia. And that means it's serving the interests of Turkey and Saudi Arabia, even as it poses a threat to them. Because neither Turkey nor Saudi Arabia want an Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon bridge that isolates Turkey and cuts Saudi Arabia off.
Israel also doesn't like the Shia Crescent at all, and they have decided to work with the Sunnis to form a parallel bloc to counterbalance Iran's influence. This is why Israel has launched numerous airstrikes against the Syrian government over the years and has provided medical care, logistical support, and safe passage to known jihadists. In 2013, Israel's ambassador to the US, Michael Oren, told the Jerusalem Post that, quote, "The initial message about the Syrian issue was that we always wanted Bashar Assad to go. We always preferred the bad guys who weren't backed by Iran to the bad guys who were backed by Iran. This was the case," he said, "even if the other bad guys were affiliated to Al-Qaeda." Let that sink in for a moment. Now, at this point, if you were to ask any of these governments directly why they're arming and funding jihadists in Syria, they would claim that they are only supporting the moderate rebels, specifically the FSA.
We believe there are around 70,000 Syrian opposition fighters, principally the Free Syrian Army, who do not belong to extremist groups and with whom we can coordinate attacks on ISIL.
FSA commanders have gone on record to say that they cooperate with and conduct joint operations with al-Nusra, and ISIS and al-Nusra have officially formed alliances. And it is well established that the FSA command has been dominated by Islamic extremists for years.
He even claimed a 70,000 strong force of moderate FSA fighters were ready to coordinate action against ISIL with the Western air campaign. That claim has not remotely stood up to scrutiny. The FSA, which includes a wide range of groups, few, if any, would regard as moderate and mostly operate in other parts of the country. The only ground forces able to take advantage of a successful anti-ISIL air campaign are stronger jihadist and Salafist groups close to the ISIL-controlled areas.
And let's not forget about the oil. At this stage, ISIS has reached a point where it no longer needs direct sponsorship. The organization earns an estimated $1 to $2 billion a day through oil sales. The US was aware of this, but did nothing to stop it. They didn't even condemn the country which was facilitating the sale of this oil. Russia, on the other hand, began targeting oil convoys headed into Turkey in November of 2015. Shortly thereafter, Turkey shut down a Russian Su-24 that supposedly violated Turkish airspace for 17 seconds. In response, Russia released satellite evidence that they claim shows how Turkey is smuggling oil from ISIS. The US government dismissed this evidence, but didn't counter it with any evidence of their own. So where is the oil going?
All along, there's always been the idea that Turkey was supporting ISIS in some way. We know they've funneled people going through Turkey to ISIS. Someone's buying that oil that ISIS is selling. It's going through somewhere. It looks to me like it's probably going through Turkey. But the Turks haven't acknowledged that.
They knew, but they did nothing. Why? Well, let's ask Mike Morrell, former deputy director of the CIA.
There seemed to have been a judgment that, look, we don't want to destroy these oil tankers because that's infrastructure that's going to be necessary to support the people when ISIS isn't there anymore. And it's going to create environmental damage.
The United States and France are keen to make a show of airstrikes and special forces, but what they really want is the ability to operate in Syria militarily. This is the only way they'll have any chance of influencing the outcome. Trouble is, Russia is dug in. Unlike the United States and France, they have permission to operate in the country, and this has allowed them to set up bases and a strong anti-aircraft defense grid, which at any point could be used to enforce a no-fly zone. Washington is in a weak position. Can't really win from this angle, so they'll have to find a way to put Russia off balance and retake the momentum. It's important to remember the real stakes in this conflict. The West is in a state of decline. Their influence is waning. If the US and their allies fail to remove Assad from power, what they will be faced with is more than just a strong Shia Crescent. If they fail, they risk being edged out of the entire region and replaced by Russia. This would give Russia an enormous amount of leverage in global energy markets. And this, of course, has serious implications for the petrodollar. For Washington, this is an unacceptable outcome, so expect the unexpected.